Welcome to Strathroy and District Historical Society's online presentation on British Homechildren by Dan Oatman. This presentation took place on January 18th, 2021 via Zoom. For more information on SDHS, please visit our Facebook page at facebook.com/Strathroy Historical Society or our website at sdhsociety.weebly.com.
I wanted to invite Dan to be our first guest presenter. Normally September is British Homechild Month. And so we didn't get to discuss the topic or learn more about the topic last September because of COVID. So I thought this would be a wonderful presentation to start with for January. So Dan, as you may already know, he's been researching his family history since 1967. He, about 6 years ago, he began research on his maternal family history, and he discovered that his maternal grandmother and her sister were both British home children. So that began his research into their history and their journey as home children. So right now he's currently writing a book about their stories. I think it's called To Boston and Beyond, British Home Children Sharing Their Stories. And during his presentation, he will share some of those journeys with us. So without further ado, I will invite Dan to come off of his mic and share with us British home children and sharing their stories.
All right. Everybody hear me okay? Good. Excellent. This is a part of our Canadian history that almost got lost. The story of the 100,000 children that came to Canada between 1869 and 1948, because many of the children did not talk about them. My grandmother shared very, very little of her experiences. We knew she came as a child. We didn't know the circumstances. We do now. She mentioned very briefest of little snips of her childhood, and we had no idea until I got into the history that she and her sister were actually part of the British home child movement. These children came from Great Britain, and that's what, or the British Isles, and that's why they came from all parts: England, Scotland, Ireland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. So the children came from all throughout the British Isles. They were given the name home children because they lived in homes in England, and there's over 40 different groups that were operating at one time, sending children to Canada. And when they came to Canada, they came to receiving homes, and those receiving homes were right from the Maritimes right out to British Columbia, except for Newfoundland, and Newfoundland was not part of Canada at that point. These children were counting on the idea that they would get a better place to live, have a chance to have more opportunities. At one point, there's an article mentioned the fresh air of Canada, but there was a lot of issues. The home child movement came out of, the first one was 1869 for Louisa Britt, and they went to Niagara-on-the-Lake. And I don't know whether you're familiar with the orphan trains in the US, where they took the children from cities like New York, put them on trains, and then shipped them across the country, and people met the trains at the station and picked the children out. That's where she was inspired by her idea for the home children. And the intent, as the movie says, was born of the best of intentions. They wanted to give the children a better life than they were getting in the slums and the ghettos of England and other large cities. The Victorian industrialization was having a major impact. Children really didn't go to school. Young boys would often work in coal mines and places like that. So there was not much opportunity for them to get an education or anything of that nature. And so they were given, taken into the homes. Probably Bernardo's was probably the best known, but there were others, Quarriers, Annie McPherson, Louisa Britt, a lot of the church organizations, the Salvation Army, the Anglican Church, the Roman Catholic Church, and other church groups as well. So there was over 40 of these agencies sending children to Canada. The placements were not always chosen carefully. To send young boys out of the city onto a farm and expect them to know how to milk cows and even know what a cow looked like was difficult for these young kids. And the farm life was not made easy for them. Oftentimes there was very little instruction, a lot of beating or mistreating. I wish I could say all the children were treated well. They weren't. There were some children who were confined to live in barns with the hay and suffered frostbite in our winters. Some children were ostracized from the homes if guests came because they were just home children. The children in school were often picked on because they talked funny, they had a British accent, and the children didn't. The politicians and others saw these children as having corrupted gene pools and bringing disease and corrupting the morals of the children here, and they didn't want them to come. There's opposition. They were to given the children schooling and attend church. Those were two of the requirements. And many times the children were denied school by the people they lived with because they didn't see the need to educate these children. And when the children were available, the local school boards turned them down, said, we don't want these kids here in our school. So there was a lot of issues. And there was a lot of families who treated them well. My grandmother appears to have been treated very well from the records we found. The only comment that she made when the inspectors, and I think it probably could go through the majority of the children, was that she didn't feel loved. And that's, from a small girl, that's a pretty profound statement. And I suspect that's what it was. If the children died in care, they were often buried in unmarked graves. There was really no thought that anyone would be interested in having a marker on them. A few years ago in Parkland Cemetery in Toronto, there was a mass grave of 70 of these children found, and the researchers put the names together of all the children, and there's now a monument on that site with their names. So the children I can think, here's a good example of the success of a children's family. When I was in Nova Scotia a few years ago at a reunion down there of the Homechildren, there was a family at the end. There was I think there was 4 generations saying a blessing to those leaving in Gaelic. Now, they were the descendants of a home child. And he arrived and was placed in a Gaelic home, speaking home. He spoke English and they spoke Gaelic. And very quickly, to be able to communicate, he learned Gaelic. And he taught his children Gaelic as they grew up. And they taught their children. So that experience of they're not native speaking Gaelics, but they have adopted it as a tribute to the people that raised them. And I thought that was a very special honoring of the descendants of the home child to do that. There's some of the young men became very successful as farmers. There was one young man stayed all his life with the farmer, and when the farmer died, he had no other relatives, and he left the property to the boy to stay and farm. There's other instances of like things treated well. the young men in World War I signed up in big time. Over 10,000 of them enlisted in World War I to fight for Canada. And there were a lot of times there was two primary reasons why they enlisted. One, they wanted to get out of a bad situation, and or two, to find family in England. They all were looking for family, which they didn't have. So these young men served. Over 1,200 were killed in action, and 2 of them went on to become Victoria Cross winners. And the top decorated soldier of World War I was a home child, Claude Nunny, and he got his award only after he died for the Victoria Cross. So they served with valor. And the Strathroy Memorial, there are 2 home children on there, and I've forgotten their names, but there are 2 home children that are on the Strathroy Memorial as well for being killed in action. So they contributed. They're proud, but they remain silent. Very few of them ever shared their experiences. Very few of them ever told of them. Like I mentioned, my grandmother, just little things that she mentioned. She lived near Carp. She remembered she didn't like peppermint because if she did something that wasn't right, she was given a spoonful of peppermint and made to stand in the corner. So she never liked peppermint after that. It was just little things like that. There wasn't much, but she never shared. And we often thought it was odd that she never talked about her parents. We knew she had 2 sisters. One had died before I was born and one died after I was born. But other than that, we knew very little about her family. And as my research started into her family, I began to put a story together that probably my grandmother would be very shocked at. One of the things when I was working on my Oatman side of the family history and delving into its roots back into the Netherlands, she told me one day as I was sharing some of the things I'd found, she says, whatever you find out about my family, I don't want to know. I thought it was the most oddest request. Most people want to know about their family. But now that I know her story, that makes sense. She had turned her back. She wanted nothing to do with her family because they had abandoned her. Her parents simply walked out and left the children in an apartment and abandoned them. And so she didn't have any use for the family, except a lot of anger towards her father. Up near Muskoka, there's another branch of Crawfords. That was her maiden name. And there was a fellow there who had a name similar. It wasn't him, but we remember seeing her in anger stomp on the grave. And as if that's who I think it is, I hope you're in hell. So there is a lot of anger. And I'm thinking that if I could have found this story out while she was alive, maybe she would have had some opportunities to heal, discover. She had more siblings than she ever dreamed. And it's a story of her journey. So I'm going to share some of the things from the book, not everything, but some of the things. And that's the way that my presentation is going to put together, is on that book. So excellent. Good stuff. The book is called To Boston and Beyond, British Home Children Sharing Their Stories. Now, why is here to Boston? Because it's the only, let me backtrack. Most of the, about 98% of the children landed in Canada. Some landed in Portland, Maine. One landed in Philadelphia, and the ship that my grandmother came on was landed in Boston. It was the only one. The reason why there are sunflowers is the yellow sunflower is the official flower of the home children. And in my research, I discovered that there is approximately 70 different kinds of sunflowers, including the flower that you don't like in your lawn, the dandelion. And the sunflowers range in height from about 12 inches to over 10 feet, with the record being about 30 feet tall. And they range from single flowers to plants with dozens of blooms or so on each one. These are the two home children. My grandmother, Lily Ethel Crockford, who lived from 1891 to 1983, and Mabel May Crockford, her sister, 1892 to 1933. The first section we'll be talking about what I call the beginnings for my grandmother, from her birth date, May 10th, 1891, to July 17th, 1902, when she left Liverpool for North America. So far, I have found these places where she lived, in different places that she lived. In 1891, 92, 95, different places in London. She was a workhouse with her mother and her sisters. They lived in Liverpool. In 1897, they were in London. 1898, she was in the workhouse under Annie McPherson. And it's interesting to note this workhouse that my grandmother was in was the same one that Charlie Chaplin was in. He left about a year before she arrived. And then in May 1902, she was transferred from Annie McPherson to Bernardo's, went to Barkingside in England. This is her intake picture from Bernardo's, and Bernardo's is one of the only agency that regularly took intake pictures. The other agencies didn't. Sometimes they would take a picture of the group leaving or arriving, but they didn't identify who was who in the pictures. And when we got our package from Bernardo's, this was well worth the money, because it's the only picture we have of her prior to her marriage. This is the Barkingside village in England. This around that, you can see there's all kinds of little cottages, and there would be between 15 to 1,600 girls at a time in that village. On July 17th, 1902, and up to June 11th, 1911, when she got married, the next section of the book will be New World Journey, and that will be covering the leaving from Liverpool. There were 388 children who left from England, came to Boston by train to Montreal, and then were shipped across Canada. And that includes my grandmother, who ended up in Peterborough at the Hazelbury home. And included will be a story of one boy who died on ship, who was buried at sea, and one boy who died as a result of an accident disembarking at Boston. And this is one of the items that came with my grandmother. We didn't know her story, but when she died, as we're cleaning the house out, we found a few things that she marked she brought from England. And so because she still had them, we kept them, and we were so glad we did, because these are some of the things that came with her in 1902. This would have been typical of her trunk. This isn't her trunk. This is another home child's trunk. And in the trunk, there's other things that she brought with her. This is what the Bernardo trunks look like. Give you an idea, and quite often their names were wrote in them. This one says Miss Blanche Thornton, and actually she was the daughter of our home child, and underneath is her mother's name, Florence Peters. And this is giving you an idea just what the trunks like. This one is not in the best shape. It's been around. You can see it's missing one of the handles, but still, it's a special keepsake. And it has tiny little wheels on the bottom for moving around. Now, when they were going to leave England to board the SS New England, there was a march past, and they were marched past dignitaries, almost like little soldiers going to battle. That's what it reminded me of. These 400 children marching past these people in the stands. I've been trying to see if there's a picture of this event, but I haven't found any yet. So hopefully I can find one. This would have been the station that they left from to go up to Liverpool. This is Liverpool about 1906. Probably wouldn't have changed in the 4 years my grandmother had been here. And this is what the ship looked like that she sailed on, the SS New England. You can see that there's still a bit of carryover from the mass and the steam. When he arrived at Boston, there was a U.S. Customs report filed with the ship manifest. And these are a couple of questions. And I thought, again, is so typical of the attitude towards the home children. And the question before, did the children arrive any other places? They said yes, St. John or Quebec. And the answer was, and the second question was, did they examine the children when you arrive at St. John or Quebec? And the answer was, they just count them. Did they check off the names? No. And that's sort of, well, we've got 398 children. That's fine. Well, hopefully it's all the 308 children we should have. There was really no identity with them. The young boy, William Hartley, was buried at sea July 23rd, 1902. I now discovered who his family and his parents and his siblings are, and now know where he's buried at sea. I found in British Consulate records the longitude and latitude of where he was buried, and it's about 190 kilometers south of Newfoundland. And we know his location. This is what would have been sort of probably similar to what happened. This is an actual picture, but there have been children were brought on deck, and there have been the adults in the crew, and they put them overboard. The third-class dining room where the children would have ate, I could imagine there's probably several sittings to get 400 children into that room. And these are the berths. Probably the small children bunked a couple together. This is what Boston would look like when they arrived. This is 1906, but you can see they transition. There's still tall ships in the harbor, and there's steamers. This has been one of the buildings that would have been there, the immigration center, but they wouldn't have gone through there because they were not immigrating into the States. They went right from the ship to the train. Sadly, there was a young boy disembarking, Edward George Adderley. Again, I now know his parents and his siblings are. I've got pictures of where he's buried in the cemetery. Someone was down there and they went to the Boston Cemetery, took pictures. This is a map of where he's buried with an arrow. And it took a while to find him because his name was spelled wrong in the Massachusetts burial and the cemetery records. And fortunately, the Massachusetts cemetery, death records let you search by date. And I put the date in and I found a match for him. So it seems like sometimes the pieces take a little bit of work to find. I have permission from the Boston newspapers to use a few nice articles that were in the papers. And I put this one in again, reflective of the attitude. The heading is Bernardo Waif Dead, and it reflects just the attitude towards these children. And you can see there, even newspapers got the name spelled wrong, Adley, and his name is actually Adderley. They dropped the ER for some reason, and that's why it took a while to find him. Now, the question I had was, why did they come to Boston? And there's the fellow who supervised it, Albert Owen, wrote a 9-page article. Again, I'm going to be including that in my book, which Bernardo's agreed to let me print. He gave 9-page account of this trip. It is tremendous detail. Very few home children have that description. And the reason why they came in 1902, because in 1902, the Boer War was finished. The Canadian government requisitioned ships to go to South Africa and bring the troops home. And one of the ships that these children were booked on to come from Liverpool to Canada, the SS Canada, was actually bringing troops home. So they booked a ship available, the SS New England, from Liverpool to Boston. And on this particular ship as well, according to the newspaper article, were lots of British Empire dignitaries returning home from the coronation of King George. So it's a really interesting story. This would have been typical passenger train in the prior 1920 that would have brought the children from Boston to Quebec, to Montreal. When they arrived in Montreal, they were transferred to Canadian Pacific, and from Canadian Pacific transferred the children across Canada. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a first-hand account who supervised it, and he called it our Midsummer's Contingent. I'm not quite sure why he called it that, but it gives a lot of detail about the journey and the deaths of the two boys and so on. And in my book, I'm going to be featuring the stories of some children who sailed. I've got about a couple dozen so far, and stories of family. This particular one is Thomas Eberly, and this story would be in there, and it'll have a picture. So just as a tribute to some of the almost 400 children who came. When she arrived in Peterborough, this would have been the CPR station. Most of the children came by CN, but because the CP was involved with the distribution, this would have been looked like when they arrived. The girders probably the same minus the graffiti, but that's very much what it would look like when she came, and what it looked like going out the other way. This was the school she would have attended in Peterborough when she was there, at the Bernardo Home Hazelbrae. Her first placement was in a little place about 20 minutes due west of Peterborough called Fleetwood. It's a ghost town now. I think it's a farmhouse, and that's about it. This is sort of the road there. I took pictures of the school there, and my research just over this last fall, I discovered that this is not the school she would have attended. It was built after she was attended. It was a wooden school, so I've got to go back now and see if I can find a picture of the wooden school to put in there. And that's just confirming the dates of the school. This was about 1911. This is what Fleetwood looked like, almost like a ghost town back then, not much. You see the country roads very similar, a little narrower. And this was the building she stayed in, the general store, from 1902 to 1904. And I think it was a very good place. She enjoyed being there, and but she was moved on. And there were two other places that I will be including as well. I'm just waiting for things to open up to complete some research on them. The next part would be the legacies. After June 7th, 1911, when she got married, in 1913, they built my grandparents built a house, and in 2013, the owner at the time had a 100th anniversary party for it, and we had a chance to go through the open house, and it was so neat to go through and relive family memories. My grandmother was there. One of the things that, and this, I was talking about the little tidbits that my grandmother commented on, our Christmas and Thanksgiving and Easter dinners, the table was just literally covered with food, like feasts. And her comment always was, no family member of mine is going to go hungry. So I expect that she experienced hunger at points in her life. And there are things I have no answers for. And I'm going to put questions in the book. How did my grandparents meet? They lived in two different areas of Ontario. And from 1909 to 1911, my grandmother lived in Park Hill with her sister Mabel, and my grandfather lived in London. We have no idea. My mom doesn't know. They never talked about how they met, but they obviously met because they got married in 1911. And this is their marker, and we're just waiting for in the spring to go ahead with an inscription on there underneath that. We're going to put a British home child on her marker in recognition. And she, as long as over 9,000 children are honored at the Hazelbrae Memorial in Peterborough, and there's her name from 1902. The memorial quilt was done in 2016, and she and her sister are on that square. The background is a part of a crochet tablecloth. I chose that because my grandmother was known for her crocheting. I suspect probably one of the things that she may have been taught either in England or on one of the farms, but she loved crocheting and she crocheted a lot of stuff. I can always remember her while we were watching TV. She'd be crocheting away, and then all of a sudden you'd be looking, and there's like about 3 or 4 feet of crochet wool on the floor, and she'd start over. She missed a loop somewhere. She always seemed to know. And this is where the family history really gets interesting. I wonder how she'll react to find out she has 2 more sisters, Alice, Maud, and Louise. There's a 3rd sister, Violet, who they did not send to Canada. And after the First World War, my grandmother sponsored her to come out to Canada to join her 2 sisters. Now, she may not even been aware of these 2 sisters. Alice Maud was about a year and a half old when she died, and my grandmother was about 3, so she may have not had any memory. Louise was born after my grandmother was placed in the workhouse, so probably we have no memory or record of her either. And there's 6 sisters I'm working on. Rose. I'm waiting for the GRO to open up in England again and see if I can get a death certificate or birth certificate for her. The other thing was, when they were abandoned in the apartment, the 3 sisters, the landlord turned them into the workhouse, as that was the social agency for them. Her father and her mother both remarried. And her mother had 3 children. Her father had 7. She has 10 more half brothers and sisters. Unbelievable for this little small group of people to a massive family. My great aunt Mabel had a shorter life. She died in 1933 on Christmas Day of a hemorrhage. And this is from her wedding picture. She was married twice. She had 2 sons from each marriage, but unfortunately the first marriage was annulled because it was discovered he was already married. Her second son went on to serve in World War II on the HMCS Algonquin and won a special citation for action with against a U-boat. This is the ship that my great aunt would come on, the Tunisian, as well. She came through McPherson House in Stratford, and then she was sent on to placements in Lambton County and ended up in Park Hill in 1907. My great aunt Mabel's grave was unknown. Her son had come through numerous times trying to find her grave, and I finally got her death certificate and tracked down the cemetery. And it was where you have to keep plugging away when you don't give up, because I contacted the cemetery records keeper, and he came back and said, no, she's not buried here. I said, the death certificate says she is. So I gave him all the information of when she died, when she was buried, who her husband was, and he came back a little while later and said, I found her. Don't ask how her name was spelled. I guess somebody along the way transcribed one handwritten list to another one, and her name was totally badly miscribed. So anyways, we found her, and we just last year put a marker on her grave to mark her spot, and we also put on there a British home child, and that's what we're going to put on my grandmother's as well. I'm going to put the stories. There's 8 other home children that had last name Crockford. The second one there was this unknown. I actually now have found his initials. Anyways, his initials are EJ, and it pays to search when you're doing shipping records, if you can find them, the outgoing from England or wherever, and the incoming to Canada or the United States or wherever, because sometimes there is different information. And the outgoing, his name was damaged. The incoming had the initials EJ. So that's where I got that from. So I'd like to do see if I can find on these children, see if they're any relation, and include them in the story as well. Now, Crystal knows these two young gentlemen. These are from a Strathroy photographer, Wilson, 1901, 1905. And there was two sleeves marked Bernardo Boy. And this was the first one. When I started sharing this around, the groups said he can't have a name. And so they didn't nickname him. They gave him the name of Dan because I found him. They said he had to have a name. So I very humbly and proudly share my name with him. Then a little while later, I was going through the list of them and I found another folder that appeared to be from Bernardo Boy and Crystal checked. Yes, it was. And this is the second one. These have no names, and which is again so typical, just Bernardo Boys, but they're both dressed well. And so he had to have a name. So I gave him my second name, which is Donald. So these two young men now have temporary names, and I will include their pictures in the book, even if I can't find their names, so that their stories, their pictures won't be lost. And hopefully someday we can find, I'm going to do a major push again in the spring, early summer, to see, again, to see if anybody can identify them. I'm going to do a little bit of a children's part in the back to help them understand what abandonment means from nature. Now, this mother robin built her nest in the eavesdrop, not the best place, but she got flooded out several times, but she seemed to persist. And I took a picture of her nest one time when she wasn't there. She had 3 nice blue eggs. And one day I noticed that she was gone. She didn't seem to be around. And so I got up and I photographed the nest, and there was 1 egg left. I have no idea what happened to her or the 2 other eggs. There was like no feathers, there was no shells. Just a complete mystery of what happened. This egg was just simply abandoned. And then one time I took my back door, and right in the middle of the grass, out of nowhere, was this egg, small egg laying there. Again, where it came from, I don't even know what type of bird it is, but it was there. Okay. All right. Okay. Anyways, that's the story of my grandmother and her sister. And there will be more when the book comes out. I can assure you, there's lots more stories I'm going to include. And anyways, I don't know what else I can tell you right at this point. Someone asked me one time what my reaction was to being a home child descendant. And looking back on my story and the stories of many other of the home children, I said I'm proud to be a descendant of a British home child. And I should mention to you that there are 2 surviving that we know of home children still in their 90s. One lives in London, one lives in Sarnia, and they actually both came on the same ship together. And a couple of years ago, a reunion was arranged for them to get together. And we were going to do a reunion again, but unfortunately, COVID and stuff, that's going to have to be put aside for now. So there's not many of our home children left. It's like our First World War soldiers all gone. Our Second World War soldiers are all in their 90s and early 100s, and we're going to lose them. And in due course, we're going to lose the stories. I fortunately was so pleased to have both of them at different times share their stories in my presentations live, and got to meet them and know them. And it was fascinating to hear firsthand their experiences. And they both had good, but they also had experiences that were not pleasant either. Not good memories, but they shared them so that people would know. Anyways, I thank you for letting me take a few minutes to share. I'm sorry about that video clip, but please go to YouTube and looked up the full version, Born of Good Intentions. It's 43 minutes. It gives you a really good history of the whole British home child movement.